very excited to be here with such an amazing panel of experts on this topic. Carla Quintana, who was Comisionada Nacional de Búsqueda, in charge of leading Mexico's efforts to locate the missing. As you may know, there are more than 100,000 people missing in Mexico, so Carla had a very significant task. My fellow from the Radcliffe Institute, Rosalba Aida Hernandez, who is an anthropologist studying collectives of women who search for their missing loved ones in Mexico. And finally, Margarita Garcia Hernandez, Maggie, who is a searcher herself, who searched for years for her own daughter and is fortunate enough in some ways to have located her daughter living here in the US, and she's going to talk about her experiences. So I'd like to invite first Carla to talk about her work, and thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I would like first to thank the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies for the invitation. It's good to be back after 15 years to Harvard University. First, I would like to say hi, buenos días, buenas tardes, Margarita, y a todas las buscadoras que nos están siguiendo en redes. I was asked to speak in English and to share with you some of my experience as former commissioner for the search of the disappeared in Mexico. I'll do my best to do it in 15 minutes, but if I'm not making it, please let me know. In order for us to
have the PowerPoint there?
Yeah, sorry. Good. Yeah. Yes, I did. For the microphone.
You sent it?
Email.
Yeah. Put on that.
Well, I'm gonna start. Before talking about what we were able to build in the National Commission and what's going on now with the system, with the search system in Mexico, I think before that we had to have some context of what was happening before 2019 in Mexico. Why 2019? Yeah. Yeah. Why 2019? 2019 because it was the first year of this presidential administration, this sexennium. You can remember that Manuel took office in December 2018. And in 2017, by the end of 2017, the Congress approved the law on disappearance. So it took 1 year. When we got there, the law had only existed for 1 year, and that law created the commission, created the search system. So I think it's important for us to know what was going on before 2019. Of course, many people here have heard and are experts in Mexican history and drug cartels, but when we talk about violence in Mexico, we have, at least from the second half of the 20th century and the first and the 21st century, we have to think of two different time periods or time frames. First, the Guerra Sucia, the so-called dirty war, which was a strategy from the Mexican government to kill, disappear, and torture political dissidents in Mexico, and it went from around the 1960s till the 1980s, but the beginning of the 1990s, depending on what, depending on what you consider when it's finished. Then there's a war on drugs, and you've heard about Felipe Calderon Hinojosa, and alumni from here, Harvard University. He was president from 2007 to 2012, and he declared the so-called war on drugs to allegedly combat, and I'm saying allegedly because tomorrow we're going to talk about this, combat the organized crime or the drug cartels. Beginning with the war on drugs, well, after the war on drugs, there have been hundreds of thousands of people murdered in Mexico. There have been, we didn't know the figure, but we Mexicans imagine that we have tens of thousands of disappeared in Mexico. We imagine that we have tens of thousands of non-identified bodies, but we didn't know there was not official information. We didn't have the figures. We didn't have the databases. We didn't have systematized registries and official databases. There was a lack of legal and administrative infrastructure. There was a lack of protocols to search and to investigate. There was lack of protocols for immediate response regarding the search of persons. There was lack of interinstitutional coordination. We have to remember that Mexico, as well as the US, is a federal government. So we have federal institutions and local institutions, and it's very difficult for them to coordinate in any matter, and specifically regarding disappearances. There was a lack of a forensic methodology to respond to all the unidentified bodies that we had all over the country. We had a lack of forensic staff. We didn't have enough, and still we don't have enough anthropologists, archaeologists, criminologists, and so on and so forth. There was a lack of coordination among federal and local authorities, where I said that. There was still is lack of prevention of disappearances. I'm on the third one now. Please, the third slide, the one with the picture. What a black and white picture.
Yeah, I'm telling you.
Okay. There was a lack of human and financial resources at state and federal level to respond to the crisis. The relatives, los familiares de las personas desaparecidas were searching on their own without any official or planned support from the Mexican government. Is that the previous one? There was a denial, and I have to underline this. There was a denial of the crisis. Is the previous one? There was a denial of the crisis. When I say this, is that the Mexican government officially said at the UN that there was not such a thing as crisis of disappeared people. There was not such a crisis of a forensic crisis, and it was in at the beginning of 2018. So, like, families of the disappeared, like relatives of the disappeared, already were searching all over the country. We already knew we had all these problems, but the Mexican government was in denial. There was a weakening of local police, and this has been a big problem, a huge problem in Mexico, because we don't have a strong civil force to respond to what's going on. With Felipe Calderon, the country was militarized. The militaries were taken outside, and they're all over the country. There was negligence, collusion, and corruption in many cases between organized crime and different levels of authorities. It can be the municipal level, the state level, or the federal level. And then, with all this, in 2011, el Movimiento por la Paz con Justicia y Dignidad, it was a collective, that was a huge group of victims and survivors and relatives that disappeared, and victims of many different kinds of violence in Mexico, got together and created this movimiento, this movement. And they push the government in so many ways, but the two most important ones that I would like to share with you are the victims law, la ley de víctimas in 2013. So they were able to push the Mexican government to create a law. It was at the end of Felipe Calderón sexenio and at the beginning of the sexenio of Peña Nieto, of the administration of Peña Nieto. And then by the end of Peña Nieto's administration, President Peña Nieto's administration, they pushed to create the law and the system regarding disappearances in Mexico. So it is very important because when we think of relatives of the disappeared, we only think of women looking for the loved ones in the territory, like all over the country. Of course they do that, they shouldn't do it, but they do that. But they do much more than that. They have created and they have obliged the government to create public policy. And we're going to talk about this tomorrow with much more detail, but I think it's very important for us. Can we move to the next one, please?
I don't have it here, but yeah.
There, yeah. Thank you. I think it's very important for us to understand one thing, that the families of the disappeared push in the law. It's because of them that we have this definition of disappeared. When we talk about disappearance in Latin America, we normally think of Argentina, of Chile, Brazil, Guatemala, and we're thinking only on enforced disappearances, the ones that are directly committed by state agents, right? But when we talk about disappearance in Mexico, and we have to have a deep conversation in this probably tomorrow, we're talking of a much of a broader definition. We're not only talking about enforced disappearance. So that definition, and I'm going to read it, and that is in the law, is we consider this disappeared person to the person whose whereabouts are unknown, and there is a presumption based on any information that their absence is related to the commission of a crime. So can you imagine that is a very, very broad definition. It can be an enforced disappearance. It can be disappearance by private actors, organized crime, or gang members. It can be kidnapping. It can be human trafficking. It can be forced recruitment, and so on and so forth. So someone is missing. So we don't know the whereabouts of that person, and we have some information that he or she, they are being victims of a crime. It doesn't matter what crime. So our definition is very, very broad. And the other thing that the families push for it to be in the law is this definition of missing person. Of course, we all over the world we have definitions of missing persons. It's back. I think we have problem with that. Well, of missing persons. Well, anyway, we have when someone is missing in any country, and we don't know what happened, and we don't have any information as what happened to them, we consider them missing, and they can be missing for years, right? It's in many in Latin American countries we call them ausente, a persona ausente. However, in Mexico, as there is so much violence and so many different kinds of violence, and there is such a high rate of impunity, the family of the disappeared are like, well, if someone goes missing and no one looks for them and no one investigates what happened to them, they might be victims of a crime. So they were very keen in including in the law that after 3 days, any person that is missing is considered that is being victim of a crime, even though we don't have any information. Why? Because, again, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow with more detail, because there is lots of impunity and because no one investigates a crime and no one was looking for them. So these are the two definitions that I want you to keep in mind when we talk about disappeared in Mexico. Now we're on that we're in the right one. So how to face the multiple crises related to disappearance as a state matter? Well, of course, when we talk, I mean, had the honor to be the head of the National Commission for the Search of the Missing, but the National Commission is not the only one, or is not the only institution, and should not be the only institution in charge of facing this huge humanitarian problem. We have to think of it as a state matter, as a state affair, and we have to think of how to prevent disappearances, how to look for the disappeared, how to investigate all the disappearances, how to analyze and create all this investigation context analysis, we call it, in order for us to understand what's going on, who's being disappeared, when, why, and where. And we have to have a different approach regarding human identification. It's not only, and that's what I'm gonna try to explain to you what we were thinking on the commission, but it's not only a matter of budget. It's not only a budget, it's a matter of methodology too. But we're gonna talk about that. So can you help me with the next one, please? Yep. I have the incorrect one, but anyway. So when I was named commissioner, it was February 2019, and I think one of the first things we have to say, to be fair, that this has been the first government that actually publicly recognized that there was a crisis regarding disappearances and that there was a forensic crisis. And it did so in December 2019, only 3 days after AMLO took office. We had a hearing at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights here in Washington. And the Mexican government recognized that there was a crisis. So that was a turning point in terms of what to do, or what to start doing, or what we were able to start doing to create an institution for the relatives of the disappeared. So the first thing we had to do was to create a registry. When you go to an institution and you are, no, the previous one, please. Yeah. When you are the institution in charge of looking for the disappeared, the first question you have to ask yourself is, whom am I looking for? Who are they? Where were they disappeared? How old were they? Or were they women? Were they men? Did they belong to an LGBTI group? Were they indigenous? Were there journalists? Were there, and so on and so forth, right? So we had the task to build the first national registry. Well, there was a previous one, but it wasn't systematized. So we create this system, el Registro Nacional de Personas Desaparecidas, which has been on the spot in the last year, and we can talk about that later. As of today, if you go today to the registry, you can see there are 116,000 people that have been disappeared as of 1952 till today. 1952. The first registry that we have in the Registro Nacional is from 1952. I checked today. It's public, but of that, 114,000 have been disappeared between 2008 till today. So most of them are from Calderon's sexenio till today, right? So we had the task to create databases. The Fiscalía General de la República, the Attorney General, had to create several databases that are still not working. We can talk about that later. But we in the commission created databases of clandestine graves or mass graves on claimed and deceased persons. We were building a forensic database at the end of the last year. We have a very complex system for the dirty war period that we call it the Angelus. that helped us to look for disappeared people that were reportedly disappeared back then. It was the first time, I know it's unbelievable, but it was the first time in Mexican history that someone was crossing the databases in order to look for the disappeared. So we started doing that in these previous 4 years. We created protocols, we created guidelines, and we built them with the families of the disappeared, with the relatives, and with NGOs, and with colectivos, and with national and local authorities and international organizations. We created guidelines for context analysis. We did many studies regarding context analysis directed to look for the disappeared. Because when you talk about, in Colombia, when you talk about analysis de contexto, context analysis, you normally think of studies that are directed to know what happened or who's responsible of what happened. But the question we were posed was, where are they? So we had to analyze what's going on in different parts of Mexico in order to try to understand what happened to them and where the plausible hypothesis to find them. Where could they? We created the 32 local search commissions. As I was telling you, Mexico is a federal government, so we have to create local institutions and federal institutions. Mexico accepted the competence of the UN Committee for Enforced Disappearances in October 2021. And we were the first country that accepted the visit of this committee. So there was, at some point, political will. I think it's fair to say that we had, my God. Well, I'm going to try to hurry. We went to from having $23 million of budget to $63 million. We went from being 43 staff to being 240. I'm gonna leave you that because I'm not gonna finish. Can you? I want to talk about next slide, please, because this is very important. We started building a public policy on human identification, and this is very important because it's one of the things that is being dismantled right now. I'm gonna leave my presentation there, but I think the most important thing for you to know is that, as I was telling you, we didn't have the figure of how many people were unidentified in Mexico. Not because of the government, but because of the colectivos, we know that at least 52,000 people are unidentified in Mexico. So we pushed, among many other things that we did, we pushed the government to include, and the president was the one who sent the bill to the Congress to create what we call a massive approach to identify the missing, which is very different, and it takes experiences from the Balkans, from what was done in Argentina with el Equipo Argentino de Antropología con la Fundación de Antropología Forense de Guatemala. I think we can talk much more later about this, because it's as I was telling you, it's not about budget. It's not only about money. It's about methodology, and that is being lost. The next one, please. Well, that's the explanation of forensic massive approach. I'm not gonna delve into that. The next one, please. I think this is very important for us to talk. If I can have, yeah. I have two more slides that are important.
Yeah, that's okay.
It asked me to talk about what challenges or obstacles we had in building the commission. Well, I cannot put so many slides, so I try to. But I'm first. Let's say something. Let's think about Argentina. Let's think about Colombia. Let's think about Chile, Brazil. Facing the disappearance and forensic crisis is not easy for any government. Talking about figures and what's going on, it's not easy for any government. You have to think that the National Commission of the Search of the Disappeared is part of the Ministry of Interior of the Mexican government. It's not an autonomous institution. Maybe it should be, but it's not. So we were part, that the commission is part of the government and had the obligation to create all this. One of the main problems, it's that almost none institution thinks of this as a state problem and a state issue. So is it like, oh, there's a commission there's a national commission, they are in charge. And we have to think of this, as we were talking previously, as something more integral. There was lack of coordination and political will with some authorities. Most of the local governments do not send money or create budget for the search of the disappeared. Even though the National Commission did have budget, and it was an increasing budget, it was not enough because most of it was directed to the local governments. There was lots of tension that there are some experts here, but there were lots of tensions between the commission and the comisiones, the search commissions, and the fiscalías, and we have to talk about that deeply. There's a lack of legal frame to share the information. One of the biggest problems is that no one wants to share information, and when they want to share the information, it's not accurate in many times. And we're going to talk about this tomorrow, but we were working in a context of violence and impunity that is not recognized. So you're part of the government and you have to work in this context. And you have to conduct searches in territories that are controlled by the organized crime. And you have to organize the search, and you have to talk to state and non-state actors. And this has never been said from the government side. Of course, the familiares say it all the time. There's a lack of humanitarian approach and tools in the search of the disappeared, because when you talk about comisiones de búsqueda, search commissions, you think of Colombia, you think of Guatemala, you think of Peru. But in those countries, the government has accepted that there's a conflict. And tomorrow we're going to talk about what's going on in Mexico. Is it a conflict? Is it a war? Is it a criminal war? We can talk about that tomorrow. But the problem is that the commissions were created in a context where nothing is happening. Families relatives of the disappeared push in order for the government to create this law, the victim law and the disappeared law, but nothing else moved. And that's a problem. I'm going to talk about, this is the last one. Casi. The next one. No, the previous one. Yep. What's going on right now? There is an attempt, and you might have heard, there is an attempt to erase as many people possible from the registry that we created, el Registro Nacional de Personas Desaparecidas, and in doing so, they are re-victimizing the relatives of the disappeared, and they are doing a very questionable process, but we can talk about that later. There is a misunderstanding. I don't know, but we can talk about if it's voluntary or not. It depends whom you ask, of the broad definition of disappeared. And I think there is an incorrect political interpretation of the crisis, the registry and its benefits and goals. More than 50% of the multidisciplinary team of the National Commission that we built, more than 50% were fired, or they were pushed to quit. And doing so, we're losing years of knowledge and destroying, or at least interrupting, several processes of search and human identification. This is it's very worrisome. The National Center of Human Identification and its massive approach methodology has been dismantled. It's not working anymore. So all the information we have there, all the process we have been constructing in these years might In the best case scenario, they are giving this information to the Fiscalía General de la República, which is a problem regarding database protection. We can talk about that later. And the US government was donating the CNV genetic lab worth $4 million. We don't know what happened to what happened to that donation, but apparently it was canceled. That's what we think. And there's an abdication of conducting the searches at national level. And the last one is, well, what to do now? We can talk about that tomorrow. All right.
Thank you so much, Carla. And now I'd like to pass on for Aida Hernandez to discuss her work.
Thank you. I don't know if they can. So I can start. I'm gonna try to be brief so we can give some extra time to Maggie, who is gonna be translated by Oscar. And I just gave a talk 2 weeks ago at the Radcliffe Institute about I'm working in a book here that is the result of 7 years of activist research with the collectives of families of disappeared people. And the book is gonna be entitled Digging for Hope, a feminist ethnography in the land of mass graves. So the longer presentation is in the Radcliffe web page. So I want to reduce my talk today to 2 or 3 points that I wanted to make more clear. I was waiting here for the PowerPoint, but I want to start. So one of the first things that I want to say is that the crisis of human rights that we're living here, that it was presented already by Carla Quintana, is a crisis that has an historical structure that we cannot understand without a structure of impunity and militarization that has built since what is called the dirty war that she already described. So I use the concept of the disappearing device, el dispositivo desaparecedor, to refer not just to the individuals, but also to the practices, to the culture, and even to the institutions that had had a continuity since the dirty war and that is still in place. In some cases, we can even have the same persons that were young soldiers during the dirty war that is still in the army, now with high positions in the army. So it's the continuity of this disappearing device that had allowed, we cannot understand what is going on now without seeing all this history. And another point that I have been repeating, and we were yesterday at Brown in the presentation of the book about the traffic of weapons from the United States. The other point is that it's not only is a local problem, that this is very related to a global problem that has to do a lot with how a lot of the crimes that had affected the life of all these young men and women were committed with weapons that came from the United States. So I think that it's very important not to see what we are describing here as a result of a failure state, like under weak institutions. From political science, it's very common to talk about weak institutions or failure state. So we have to put it in a much more global context. Even the cultures of, can we pass to the second one, please? The cultures of counterinsurgency that were built in the South Con with the Condor Plan is a culture that have traveled with the weapons. And with something that I always want to emphasize as a feminist scholar, with the patriarchal violence, with a culture of patriarchal violence that also travels with the weapons. And the other element that I want to, well, in this case, I have been talking about the place that the School of the Americas that was founded in Panama in the 1946 had played in training these cultures of counterinsurgency, using the disappearance as a counterinsurgency tool, and how this disappearing device have traveled through time. One of the most bloody cartels in Mexico, the Zetas, was formed with people that previously were part of the elite troops in Central America. So it's also, we have to make this linkage when we analyze this. So that's what the problem of disappearance is so complex that it's so important to have an interdisciplinary perspective, to have this international global perspective, but also an ethnographic perspective. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is that this problem has been present in the 3 last administrations. It came from the dirty war, because now it's election time in Mexico, and because tomorrow we're going to center in López Obrador administration. So I don't want my talk to be used as a part of a pre-electoral climb in Mexico. So this is a problem that began with a deeper dimensions with Calderón, that belongs to the right party PAN. It had continuity with Peña Nieto, that is the historical party that governed Mexico for 70-something years, and it has continuity even when we have people like Carla Quintana there, but it continues with López Obrador. So the 3 main parties in Mexico have been responsible of this human rights crisis, directly because they didn't clean the institutions that are practicing disappearance, or indirectly because the impunity continues there. So I think that if we have to clarify this in the pre-electoral times, because certainly we can easily say, oh, this is a problem of the left that didn't respond. But it's a problem that has passed through all the political parties. Then we go to the next one. And the other, to the next slide. And the other point that I want to talk is the importance that doing research not about the collectives of searchers, but with collective searchers, because they are the ones, as Carla said, they are the ones that pressure for the laws. So they did legislative lobby. They are also the ones that have been the consciousness of Mexico, showing us when people are denying that we have a human rights crisis, but also academically, they are the professors in learning how to appropriate forensic knowledge, how to have a broader conception of justice and of reparations. And I think that we are in a moment in which methodologically and ethically, we cannot continue with colonial practices in research, in which you just go to a country in the global south, appropriate social suffering, write your books in English that you never translate, come to this country and make your careers with the social suffering, and they never know what you write about. So those are colonial practices, epistemic colonialism, that we have to stop. And it's not just an ethical, because we're in an academic space, it's not just an ethical responsibility, but it's a demand that the people are doing. It very, in the case of the searchers, it's very direct, but also indigenous peoples, Afro-Mexican peoples, popular sectors are saying, we don't want to be objects of your studies. They always ask you, what for? Well, because I want to understand the kinship system of your community. What for? Because I think, what for? In the 5 times that they ask you what for, you start to realize that you have to ask yourself, knowledge for what? Why do we want to do this kind of knowledge? Can we go to the next one? And in that sense, I think that there are certain things that we can learn from what is going on with the new generation. I always talk about the new generations of scholars in Mexico that are putting the body in the field. They're risking their life. And I certainly hear these big anthropologists here talking about social suffering with such a pornographic perspective of suffering that have never been there in the field. And I see these young scholars that are in very precarious labor situations, taking risks to be doing activist research. And so I think that it's very important. Miriam Jimeno is this Colombian anthropologist who talks about citizen researchers. So what kind of citizen responsibility do we have when we do this kind of social work? And also to be public intellectuals. How can we use our knowledge to raise social consciousness about the problems that we're confronting? And in that sense, also as a professor, because I teach in a master and a PhD program, what implies doing research when you share the vulnerabilities of the people that you work with? I also think at the same time that I was calling to have an ethical responsibility, I think I'm very concerned with the kind of pornographic representation of violence in Mexico that is happening in the US academia. In this year, I have been listening to several presentations in which social suffering described in such a detail that is a new way of re-victimizing the people that we work with. And I think that we should take consciousness of why are we describing violence? What is our need? And because tomorrow's panel is going to be specific about violence, and because we have younger scholars here that are working on violence, I think that is very important. First, to put this violence into a broader context, and also to think what kind of representations that we can do can be re-victimizing for the people that we work with. If we're describing how the bodies are being treated, we have to remember that many of those people that are being searched can be part of this context that you are describing. So you have to think who is listening to you and what for. And also how our work can be used to confront this context of impunity. Can we go to the last one? So just to the last slide. So just to wrap up, I'm not gonna go very deeply. So just the ethical dilemmas of this anthropology, how not to reduce the gore capitalism through our ethnographies, through the detailed descriptions, not to have this epistemic violence of extractive methodologies, go there, get the testimony, bring here, write in English, do a career, become scholars, and forget about the people we work with. How can we do that? And also to decenter our role as intellectuals, what are dialogues of knowledge? That's what we use this name for the event. So in this knowledge, Maggie is for me a peer with whom I learn, and we have a dialogue that is political, that is ethical, that is theoretical. And we have to recognize that their knowledge about the reality are theorizations about the world, are not just testimonies to chop and put in our books without context and to use them to make our theoretical arguments. They are theorizing about the world, and we have to take them seriously, their theorizations. And well, just those two things that I want to talk, and I want to take this opportunity. I have two younger scholars that have been working with me, Katy Villanueva and Erika Familia, that are Harvard students, and I'm very happy to have them, that I think that we have to confront the neoliberal ethos of academia that make us compete against each other to get better grades and then better fellowships and then better jobs. We have a huge crisis in which we have to work collectively. We have to produce collective knowledge. We have to create emotional communities that are also political and academic communities in order to be able to produce knowledge that really can help us to construct a better world and to go for social justice. And all these institutions, especially elite institutions, Harvard, are promoting competition, are promoting individualism. So the challenge is great. We have to do it from different kind of interdisciplinary perspectives, but we also have to do it collectively. And I just want to finish, thank you, my professors, because I have learned a lot during these 7 years.
Gracias, Aida. I'd now like to present Margarita, Maggie, who's going to speak to us. I am going to translate for Maggie into English. I'm going to try and be as simultaneous as I can. I'm not an interpreter. I don't have experience in it, so we're going to see how it goes. And I ask your forgiveness ahead of time if I stumble or don't make a lot of sense. But I want to make sure that, you know, as many people as possible can hear and understand what Maggie has to say. So, Maggie, por favor.
Buenas tardes. Antes que nada, quiero mandarles un fuerte abrazo a los jóvenes que los tuvimos hoy. Un fuerte abrazo porque ellos están luchando también como nosotros por tener paz en nuestro mundo. Un fuerte abrazo para ellos.
For peace in our world.
Bueno, yo les puedo hablar de la experiencia de búsqueda y de los impactos de la desaparición y el tráfico humano en México y Estados Unidos.
I'm going to talk about the process of searching and for the
Soy integrante del colectivo Regresando a Casa Morelos, el cual se formó en el 2013, derivado del mal trabajo que están haciendo nuestras autoridades, ya que ellos no están buscándolos, ellos solamente están simulando las búsquedas, pero no lo hacen como tal. Mi colectivo está formado por más de 50 familias, el cual el 95% somos mujeres y el resto son hombres. De estos, 15 actualmente estamos activas de tiempo completo.
At this time, 15 are working full time.
Y pues antes de hacer nuestras búsquedas, nosotros nos capacitamos.
Before doing our search, we took courses to learn about how to search.
Para hacer eso, nosotros dejamos nuestros hogares por días. y semanas completas.
We left our homes for weeks at a time.
Tomamos talleres de georreferencias,
We took workshops on georeferencing,
antropología forense,
anthropology, forensic anthropology,
construcción de paz,
constructing peace,
archivamos y documentamos casos.
and they researched and documented cases.
Hacemos búsqueda en campo y en vida.
We do searches out in the field for deceased people and also looking for people who are still alive.
Pero también tomamos talleres de
We also
sanación,
took
que también nos hace falta y nos fortalece a
Workshops
nosotros
of
como
healing,
madres.
because as mothers, we still need strength and healing.
Y damos también acompañamiento a las familias que se están integrando, porque la desaparición continúa desafortunadamente.
And we also accompany families because unfortunately disappearances continue.
Pero también hemos participado como observadoras documentando la información de los cuerpos enterrados clandestinamente en Jojutla y Tetelcingo.
But we've also participated in documenting the bodies buried in two different regions of the state of Morelos, Jojutla and Tetelcingo.
In statement graves, statement graves.
Y también realizamos mesas de trabajo con PGR y Fiscalía del Estado.
And we've also held working tables with the Attorney General's office at a national level and also at the state level.
En el 2021 y 22, a Morelos llegó la Brigada Nacional de Búsqueda de Personas
In
Desaparecidas.
2021 and 2022, Morelos hosted the National Search Brigade.
Y en algunas actividades también hemos contado con el Alto Comisionado de la ONU.
And in certain activities, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has also participated.
Ahora les voy a presentar unas fotos donde están algunos, solamente son los rostros de algunas de mis compañeras.
Now I'm going to show you some photos of some of my colleagues in the search.
Can you change?
The next slide, please.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Bueno, ahora voy a continuar con el caso de mi hija. Mi hija desapareció en octubre del 2010.
My daughter disappeared in October 2010.
Cuando ella desaparece, llevaba un teléfono con ella,
When she disappeared, she had her cell phone with her.
el cual yo me estuve comunicando hasta que logré que ella me contestara
Which I was ringing and ringing until she finally picked up.
y dijo que regresaría, iría a la casa y así fue.
And she said she would come home.
Cuando ella entra a la casa iba con 2 personas muy
When she arrived
jóvenes.
home, she was with 2 young people.
Hablo con ellas y los cuestiono porque yo quería hablar con personas maduras para
Right.
llegar a un arreglo.
I've talked to these 2 young people because I wanted to talk to people who are older and get to an agreement.
Los hombres.
En ese momento pues me la pintaron muy bonito diciéndome que era un matrimonio
They told her that it was a marriage that was taking place,
y se la vuelven a llevar.
and they took her away.
En el 2012
In
mi hija regresa a
2012,
la casa
my
con un
daughter
bebé
returned home
de 1 año,
with a child, 1 year old,
el cual me dice que me lo deja porque se viene a Estados Unidos a buscar una mejor vida.
and she told her mother that she was going to leave the child with her because she was going to the United States to search for a better life.
Y yo me quedo con ese niño.
And I was left with this child.
En el 2016
In 2016,
mi hija me habla por teléfono y me comienza a decir que lo que me había dicho pues no era verdad.
my daughter starts calling me and tells me that what she told me wasn't actually true.
Que las 2 personas que habían ido a la casa
The
son
two
las
people, the two men
mismas 2 personas
That had come to the house
que la sacaron del municipio.
were the 2 people that had taken her out. of her
Uno
home.
le apuntó en la espalda
One
para
of them
meterla al
pointed a
carro a la
gun
fuerza.
to her back, put her in a car,
Y así es como a ella la desaparece.
and that's how they took her away and disappeared her.
Y me dice que los 2 años que la tuvieron en México, la estuvieron moviendo a varios estados donde la estuvieron explotando sexualmente.
And the 2 years that she was in Mexico, she was moved around to different states where she was sexually exploited.
Y cuando la trajeron aquí a Estados
And when
Unidos,
they brought her to the United
hicieron
States,
exactamente lo mismo aquí.
they did exactly
La
the same
estuvieron
thing.
moviendo a varios lugares.
They were moving her to different places.
Exactamente donde ella la tuvieron más tiempo fue en Nueva Jersey. Y
The
ese
place where she
lugar
was for the longest time was New
en donde
Jersey.
esta red de trata aún siguen trabajando.
And that's
Ellos
where
ahí
this
están,
trafficking
porque
network
hemos
continues
mi
to
hija
operate.
ha visto algunos familiares que estuvieron ahí con ella.
My daughter has seen different family members that were there in the trafficking ring with her.
Al no seguir una línea de investigación aquí en Estados Unidos,
Because there hasn't been a proper investigation
esas
here in the
personas,
United
pues ellos
States.
siguen operando acá.
These people keep operating in the United States.
Desafortunadamente, en todo este proceso, los países, México y Estados Unidos, pues no nos han apoyado como,
Unfortunately, this whole process, neither the governments of Mexico nor the United States have supported us.
Desafortunadamente, ni México ni Estados Unidos no supieron cómo ayudarnos o no pusieron trabajar ellos para decirnos a qué tenía derecho mi hija.
Neither Mexico nor the United States could help us or tell us what rights my daughter had in this situation.
Ya que la ley de víctimas de trata dice que tenía derecho a una reunificación familiar para comenzar a sanar.
The law of human trafficking says that my daughter has a right to be reunited with her family in order to heal.
Hasta el momento esto ha sido imposible,
And up until now, this has been impossible.
ya que mi familia hasta el momento de hoy sigue separada. Mi
Because my
hija
family is
no
still
puede ir
separated.
a México porque está amenazada de muerte, igual que todos nosotros, por haber levantado la voz. Eso es lo que nos ganamos nosotros.
My daughter can't go back to Mexico, and neither can I, because we're all under the threat of death because we've raised our voices.
Tengo alrededor de un poquito más de 6 meses que llegué a Estados Unidos,
I've been in the US for a little more than 6 months,
gracias a una asociación que es la única que nos ha ayudado aquí en Estados Unidos.
thanks to an organization that's the only one that has helped us here in the United States.
Es la única que se llama Caridades Católicas,
It's called Caridades Católicas.
que nos pudo ayudar solamente con 2 visas, para mi esposo y para mí.
That's been able to help us obtaining a visa for myself and for my husband.
Y yo venía con un sueño en mi ignorancia, yo pensaba que iba a estar las cosas muy bien con mi hija.
I came with a dream. In my naivety, I thought things were going to be really great once I was reunited with my daughter.
Y desafortunadamente no es así.
And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case.
La hija que me he encontrado no es la que yo parí.
The daughter that I found is not the daughter that I gave birth to.
La hija que me han dejado ahorita no me ha agredido físicamente, pero sí me agrede verbalmente, con sus comentarios, con sus actitudes. Y creo que puedo entender esa parte.
The daughter that they left me hasn't hurt me physically, but she's wounded me emotionally with her comments, with her attitude.
Este proceso ha sido muy duro, ya que no solamente nos ha dolido emocionalmente, sino también físicamente.
This has been an extremely difficult process because it's hurt us not just emotionally, but also physically.
Desde que llegué he estado buscando alguna institución o personas que nos puedan apoyar para poder sobrellevar todo esto.
Since I arrived, I've been looking for some person or some institution that can help us to deal with all of this.
Y hasta el momento pues, no he encontrado
And as of now, I
nadie que
haven't
nos
found
pueda
anyone that can help us
sostenernos como familia
to support us as a family,
para poder seguir adelante.
to keep going.
A mi hija me la han dejado marcada, no solamente del cuerpo, sino emocional y psicológicamente.
My daughter has been left emotionally and physically scarred.
No solamente destruyeron la vida de mi hija, sino de toda mi familia completa.
They didn't just destroy my daughter's life, they destroyed my whole family's life.
Porque esto me dejó sin hermanas,
This has left me without
Sin
my
padres,
sisters, without my
sin
parents,
nada.
with nothing.
Y desde que nos pasó todo esto, me he dedicado al colectivo a ayudar,
And since all this started happening, I have dedicated myself to being part of the collective and to help
a sensibilizar, pero
sensitize people,
a levantar la
educate
voz.
people, to raise their voices.
Tenemos que aprender a reeducarnos,
We have to learn how to re-educate ourselves.
a las mamás decirles y que les enseñen a sus hijos, el sexo no se compra.
So for mothers to teach their sons that sex shouldn't be bought,
Que nuestros cuerpos no se venden,
that our bodies can't be sold,
pero sobre todo a los hombres.
especially towards men.
Que mientras ustedes sigan comprando su sexo,
As
a
long as,
nuestras hijas no les van a seguir desapareciendo.
as long as you keep buying or paying for sex, our daughters will continue to be disappeared.
Así que nos toca reeducarnos.
So we have to re-educate ourselves.
Y soy la hija, la hermana, la tía, la hija que no van a poder volver a tocar.
I'm the daughter, the mother, the sister that they'll never be able to touch.
También les dejo mis redes sociales.
I'm
Por
gonna give you
aquel que
my
necesita,
social media.
quiera escuchar la historia
networks.
completa de mi hija, pero también por todos aquellos que quieran apoyar, ya que los colectivos nos hacen fuertes, los solidarios como mi querida amiga, que son los que nos sostienen, que son los que nos hacen fuertes.
I'm going to leave you my social media networks in case you want to see more about my daughter's story. And also, if you want to support us, because ultimately what supports us as collectives of searching mothers is solidarity from people like Aida, other mothers, researchers, and people who support us in our work.
Necesitamos que los jóvenes, que las iglesias nos abran espacios para
We need
poder
young people and we need churches to open
sensibilizar
their
y
doors
que puedan entendernos lo que vivimos los de este lado.
so that other people can understand what we've gone through on this side of the experience. Thank you.
I think tus redes están al final, ¿no?
Sí.
Um, well, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. I'm going to go through some questions myself, and then I'll open it up to questions from the audience and questions from Zoom. I'd like to start with Carla. You know, the issue of disappearance is so immense and has been for such a long time. So I wanted to know what it was that drew you to this role, knowing the enormity of the task that was at hand.
Well, that's an easy question. Well, I've been a human rights defender for my whole life. For more than 25 years, I've been working with the victims of human rights violations in different institutions, international and national institutions. But as we were talking, I was trying to show you, at the beginning of this sexennium of this administration, there was a political will to do something. I am not part of Morena. I have always been like a public servant, and as such, and as a human rights defender, I saw there was a window where things could work. There was the recognition of the crisis. There was so much to be done. And I have already been working with the families or the relatives of the disappeared in my previous job, which I was a national public, the head of the National Public Defense. So I knew them, and I knew we had to start building an institution from scratch, because we did it literally from scratch. When I say that is, we didn't have internet, we didn't have phones, we didn't have computers, we didn't have uniforms, we didn't have cars, we didn't have tools, we didn't have anything. We were like a bundle of 7, 8 public servants that started working on this and creating an institution that they were willing to work for us. They have been, Aida was saying that all of them have been faced with a patriarchal system, the fiscalias, the police, the military, and they created the commissions. I have always thought of the commissions, of the search commissions, as a bridge between the government and the families. And that's what we try to build. Of course, the problem is huge. An institution cannot do it alone. One institution cannot do it alone. But I think that for a time we were able to start creating, to start building the infrastructure, to start solving or trying to solve the problem, but that is not going to be solved in 1 year or in one administration. We have to build the processes, the methodologies, in order for us to be able to have some answers in 2, 3 administrations. And that can be done. My last slide was like, what should we do in order to start responding to something? And when we have to think of building all this, methodologies, all this institutions, all this coordinated work between, not only between institutions, but of course, always with the colectivos, with international organization, with international cooperation, with non-state actors. So what drove me there? My will to help, my will to learn, my will to share my knowledge, my will to and when I say I have to say, like, a lot of people that came with me. Was it enough? Is that enough? You have heard Margarita, and as long as we don't find 150 15,000, nothing is gonna be enough.
Mm.
But as a public servant, I can tell you that there are ways to build the institution, to start trying to construct some answers. And someone has to do it. And you have to do it respectfully with them that have been doing it for so long before us. And we have to listen to them. We have to bring all the knowledge from inside, but also from abroad, scientifically speaking, regarding budget and regarding political will from the government, but also, and Aida was talking about this, and it's a very complex conversation to have, but also I think there's a lack of response from the Mexican society of what's going on. Because if there was a better response, there would be more accountability of what's not happening in the country, with investigations, with identification, with the prevention of violence, and they are screaming, they're yelling, and there are some allies that are walking with them from academia, from the government, like the National Commission before. I think we were an ally, but it's not enough. If the Mexican society does not respond to this, this government or any government does not feel the pressure to change things and to have the big conversations, not only about disappearance, but about violence, but about are we going to talk about transitional justice or not? Are we going to talk about changing, reforming the laws? Are we going to talk humanitarian response? Are we going to talk about so many things? So I cannot see myself. I would finish like I cannot see myself having done something different. I think I wanted to do it. And we did our best with what we had, even though it was it wasn't enough because it has to be built with so many other actors.
And Aida, in a similar vein, you've worked in so many different fields. Your previous book was on Indigenous communities. What was it that drew you towards looking at this issue, and particularly the search collectives of mothers? What first drew you in? Why did you decide to research this? And what's been the most surprising thing about your work in this field?
Well, I started working with this after Ayotzinapa, the 43 students that had disappeared, that Oscar had been working about, his book about it. It really marked the entire society. It was a national mobilization. It was a moment in which the society, I think among other things, because there were students that were being trained to be teachers, rural teachers. So that really moved the consciousness. So that was a very moving experience, but literally it was when the collectives knocked at our door, and I'm not talking symbolically. I'm working in one of the biggest anthropological research center in Latin America. It's called CIESAS. It's a graduate program and a research center, but we do social anthropology, linguistics, and history. And some relatives came and they thought we were doing forensic anthropology, that we don't. I know nothing about forensic, but it was simply like, you do research, you are a public center, our taxes are paying, but we're in crisis. What do you know how to do that we can use? And they have been doing that in the National School of Anthropology at UNAM. UNAM was pressured by them to open the first forensic program, degree in forensic science in Mexico. So it was because of that, a group of young scholars that were some of them without institutional link, created the Grupo de Investigación en Antropología Social y Forense, the anthropological group of social anthropology and forensic anthropology. And I became part of this group. I was the senior one in this group, and they continue to be there. Now I'm just part of their academic committee. And what is very interesting is that as them are the majority are women, 98% of the searchers are women, the Mexican team of forensic anthropology are the majority women. The Grupo de Investigación en Antropología Social y Forense, we are all women. So it's very
In the
interesting
National
also.
Commission, most of us were women.
Were women. So it's very interesting also in gender terms how, and the 98% of the perpetrator are men. So I was talking about that with Diana Pardo the other day, that feminist analysis has a lot to say about what is going on in this context. Who is caring for life and who is. So that was, I started to get involved, and I tried to bring to this field what I have learned working with indigenous women. And it has to do, how can we think justice, not just from a punitive perspective, but from a restorative perspective? And also, how can we learn from other epistemologies or their conceptions of justice, of dignity, that doesn't come necessarily from law and from the framework of human rights, because there are other conceptions there. And for me, some of the most, I'm a mother. I have one son, only one, and he is the age of a lot of these young people. So it really, from all I always have done activist research. I was very close to the Zapatista movement for many years, but now it was a problem that really include my reality. It can be easily happen that my own son can be in this, and that as a mother, it really moved my guts in a sense. And I was just talking to Maggie before we start that I know a lot about the lives of many of these young men, that I feel that I know them and that I have dreamed with them, because I just start to become very close to these people. Would you learn to know them, through their mothers, through their sisters, through their wives. And so that made this very emotionally engaged research. And just to finish, before we finish, I forgot that they told me that they wanted to share with you, if later we can use the last slide in my presentation, because they are having a huge march in May the 10th. And they asked me to share with you the call for unifications, all the collectives of the country. In the last slide, first, all the collectives of the country that are almost 300. The last one are now getting together. That is in that one there. En la campaña nacional de búsqueda por la unidad colectiva nacional. It started in April the 18th, and one of their main points that I forgot, I just wanted to make it short, is that because what I said about the electoral context, they say we will not be any one political loot. Nobody manipulate us, nor do we want to politically attack the government. We just want to find or disappear people. And there are main demands in this mobilization that start the 18th. It's going to be all the next weeks until the 10th. And well, the effective search of the 112,000 disappeared people, the forensic identification of all the bodies that are under the custody of the state, a judicial reform with new prosecutors that do not reproduce impunity, a huge thing that all the Mexicans want, better executive, better legislative, and better judicial institutions, protection for all the searchers. A lot of the searchers have been killed during the search, so they want protections, and also for human rights activists, as of course, the end of the disappearance. This is a summary of the last comunicado that it was read in all the different states of Mexico at the same time in April the 18th. And with Maggie, we said that we want our presentations here to be be seen in the framework of this campaign. So we think that we're bringing the campaign to this side of the border.
Thank you, Aida. And now I have a question for Maggie, and lo voy a decir en inglés y después la traduzco en español. We've been hearing a lot from Carla, from Aida, about the idea of disappearance, the mechanisms behind it. And I wondered if you could talk to us more about the experience for you of having someone disappear. What does that do to you? What does that feel like? Te quería preguntar, ellos han hablado. Bueno, ellos han hablado mucho sobre la idea de desaparición, cómo opera, pero quería ver si nos podrías platicar un poco de la experiencia por parte de los familiares, de cómo es tener una desaparición, cómo se siente, cómo afecta una familia, una comunidad, tener un desaparecido, quizá a diferencia de tener un difunto.
La verdad que es una experiencia muy difícil para mis compañeras. Aunque yo haya recuperado a mi hija, puedo sentir esa parte de no saber, ellos, de no saber en dónde están. Ellos me dicen, están como muertos en vida. Porque si tuvieran a sus hijos con ellos, o que ya estuvieran muertos, podrían hacer un entierro digno y quitar esa parte de ellos. No sé, ya que está enterrado. Pero el no tenerlo es tenerlos a ellos en el suspenso, en ese dolor.
So Maggie's saying that even though she found her daughter, she has an experience of, for years, having that doubt of not knowing where they are, and it's living in a sense of limbo. And so she talks about her colleagues whose relatives are still disappeared, and the enormous difficulty they face by having that same uncertainty. And it's almost like having someone who's a living dead, because they're not dead, they're not alive, they're just gone. And I think that's the real pain of disappearance is that lack of knowing, that lack of certainty. And she mentioned that if someone had died, they could have a grave, they could have that kind of ritual of burying someone. But with the disappearance, that's sort of robbed of these families, and that's what makes it so painful. And Carla, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your talk about the fiscalías. For those, just as an explanation, in Mexico, every state has its attorney general's office or prosecutor's office, and there's also a national prosecutor's office. In my work as a journalist, I've often felt like one of the biggest breakdowns is the prosecutors at the state level that don't have the capacity or the institutional strength to carry out investigations, and even when they do, they're not successful. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that challenge, if that is something that you agree with, and also the challenge of managing 32 different prosecutors' office and trying to work with them as a national commissioner.
Well, you not only have to work, I do agree with you with this tension. And the National Commission has to work not only with the 33 fiscalías, the 32 local fiscalías, but the federal, la Fiscalía General de la República, the federal one. It has to work with 32 commissions, search commission. It has to work with the Guardia Nacional, with the National Guard. It has to work with the military. It has to work with police, state police, municipal police. So when you conduct a search, you have to work with, you have to try to coordinate with all these institutions, as Maggie was saying, like the first institutions that they deal with directly normally is the fiscalías, because when someone goes missing, someone goes disappear, they go and try to ask for help. I think there's a problem before talking about budget and about weakening of their institutionality. I think we have to think. Well, I'm a lawyer, I'm sorry. I apologize for that, but no one's perfect. So I think of the law and our problem, the first problem for the commissions, for the search commissions, it's a legal problem. Because as I was telling you, tomorrow we're gonna talk about violence and how we define what's going on in Mexico, but we have the figures of conflict. If you talk about murders, if you talk about disappeared people, if you talk about torture, if you talk about mass graves, if you talk about the modus operandi of how the bodies are found, if you talk about this kind of violence, like you have something going on that the ordinary system has not been able to deal with. Because they don't want to, because they don't have enough budget, because they can't, because they are colluded, because there are so many reasons of why they haven't been able to respond to what's going on in Mexico, right? And then the families that disappeared and the victims of violence in Mexico push the government to create these two extraordinary systems, the victim system and the disappearance system, which if you analyze other countries such as Colombia, such as Guatemala, such as Argentina, only happen, like search mechanisms have only been created in countries that have accepted they have some kind of conflict. Think of Sri Lanka, think of Lebanon, think of Colombia. And Mexico has not accepted that nothing is going on, so everything is it's okay. But we have these institutions that are extraordinary mechanisms, even though they are not called like that. And that these two mechanisms have to work with an ordinary system that is not willing to do the job, but is not willing to let you do the job. So that's basically the first legal political problem. And after that, then you have the local institutions that they don't have the budget because they don't. If you go, for instance, to a country, to a state, I can remember like Nayarit. You have, I don't know, like maybe 350 disappeared in these 3-4 months in 2018, and you have 3 prosecutors to deal with this 300 and something disappearances. But these 3 persons have also, like, if a mass grave is found, if a clandestine mass grave is found, they have to be there. And if someone goes missing today, they have to deal with that. So you have 3 persons trying to deal with everything, which is like not even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be able to. And that's in the best case scenario when there are public servants that are willing to do the job, because it's true that there are some public servants that are willing to do the job. We have to say that too. Yeah, they have found allies in the Fiscalia, they have found allies in the commissions, but that is not enough because it's not a structural response. You can find 1 or 2, but because when I began working on this, I thought that everyone was colluded. And of course, there's lots of collusion and there's lots of corruption. I'm not gonna say something different, but there are some all over the country, and the colectivos can tell you there's maybe 1 police officer there and 1, even if they want to do the job, they can't. It's a structural problem. First, it's a legal problem. The fact that I repeatedly said, I use the word humanitarian. We have not talked about the humanitarian response, and that has legal consequences in Mexico. And it has legal consequences in the search. It has legal consequences in the investigation. And the system is not willing to talk about that. So yes, I agree that most of the tensions and the problems are in the fiscalias. I don't think it's a problem only of budget. Of course, the budget is needed. They have to have more ministerios públicos, more forensic experts. They have to have much more tools to do their job, but that's not going to make it. Or they have to be cleaned because there's lots of collusion, lots of corruption, and the system is thought that the legal system and the forensic system is thought as all over the world in every country individually. There's a disappearance and the prosecutor is going to investigate that disappearance. There's if you are a forensic expert, you have a body in front of yourself, you think of of solving 1 problem. What's going on in Mexico cannot be solved individually. We have to think massively, and that includes investigation, and that includes search, and that includes identification. And that's why we were thinking, and with that I finished, and that's why we were thinking of building different methodologies. We had to think differently if we want to have different results. And we were trying to build that, and now they are at stake.
And just following up with that, Maggie, I wanted to ask you, te quería preguntar about your experience interacting with authorities in your own case and also in the case of the collective. tu experiencia lidiando con las autoridades, cómo ha sido tanto en tu propio caso, y me refiero particularmente a las autoridades mexicanas y estatales, como en tu propio caso, tanto como en el caso de los otros miembros de tu colectivo.
Desafortunadamente fatal.
Unfortunately, it's been terrible.
Fatal porque nuestros casos no avanzan.
Our cases don't go anywhere.
Igual como simulan las búsquedas, también simulan los casos. No tenemos avances. Solamente una palabra que utilizan mucho los MPs ya no. Les vamos a mandar recordatorios y recordatorios. Sí. Que es lo único que saben decir.
Yeah, they sort of simulate as if they're doing searches, as if they're investigating, but the cases never seem to go anywhere. And they keep telling us that they're going to give us recordatorios, like messages or
No, you have to,
reminders.
no, you send letters to other institutions for them to, can you do this, can you do that, can you give me information, and with that they say that they are doing something.
Okay, yeah, so they're sending sort of these letters to other institutions asking for help, but the case still seems to not go anywhere. I'd like to open it up now to questions.
If I can just like say something regarding
course.
what just I said, because what she said about the Ministerio Público, the prosecutor, the MP. And there was this one prosecutor from the Fiscalía General de la República. He was working in Tamaulipas. And I say that because many of the mujeres de los colectivos, buscadoras, talk and know about him. He was one of the only MPs that was willing to help. And what he did is that he brought together so many cases in Tamaulipas in only one investigation. This is what I'm telling you, that's what makes sense, right? He was thinking in a context. And he was working in Tamaulipas. He came back to Mexico City to visit his family, and he was disappeared. So that's Ministerio Público Vilchis, and I think it's fair to remember him.
And unfortunately, I think what's been most devastating in Mexico is that now we're getting to the point where the people looking for the disappeared, like this fiscal, like other mothers looking for the disappeared, like anthropologists, are now themselves being disappeared.
Or threatened. There are people from the commissions that are being threatened too.
So now I'd like to open it up to questions, both from our Zoom audience and also in the audience here in the room.
Probably taking 2 or 3 so we can.
So one question that has come from Zoom is what actions Mexico should implement in response to the forced recruitment of children and young people into organized crime in the context of the war on drugs.
Why don't we take the 2 or 3 and then we answer, because if not, it will take.
Yeah.
I wanted to know a little bit more about the current state of these processes. And you mentioned that there has been like a dismantling of the institutions and the processes that you somehow put together, right? So I was wondering if any of you, or like the 3 of you, can speak of the context of it. Why is it that it is being dismantled? You said that they were revising the numbers of people that have been registered as disappeared, and in that process being maximizing. So I just want to hear more about why is this happening right now, and yeah, like if you can tell us a little bit about the context and the implications for the collectives as well.
And just to add that, add another question that's from Zoom, that's for Carla, about the pressure you felt, if you felt pressure to reduce the number of disappearances, how that contributed to your departure from the National Commission, and whether there's any hope that, given the current situation, that these victims can still find some kind of resolution.
There's Jane.
Yeah, we'll just do 3 for now.
Yes, sir.
Entonces, la primera pregunta, Maggie, es ¿qué acciones puede tomar México para frenar el reclutamiento de los jóvenes al crimen organizado?
A ver, repite.
¿Qué acciones podría tomar el gobierno de México y la sociedad en general para frenar o reducir el reclutamiento forzado de jóvenes al crimen organizado?
La sociedad, creo que nosotros como sociedad lo que podemos hacer pues estar atentos primero de los hijos, ¿no?
To be aware and be mindful of our children.
Y que los padres, los que ya tienen los hijos, que tenemos hijos desaparecidos, que la misma sociedad nos ayudaran a visibilizar todo esto, ¿no? Que fueran un poquito más empáticos con todo esto, ¿no? Porque muchas veces nos revictimizan, diciendo que nuestros hijos se los llevaron por algo, ¿no?
And also for society at large to be more supportive and empathetic towards those of us who have disappeared children. Because a lot of times we're re-victimized and told that our son or daughter was disappeared because they were involved in something, and most of the time that's not the case.
Y el gobierno, pues yo creo que tienen que comenzar a trabajar empecemos con lo de las armas, ¿no? Empecemos ahí con lo de las armas, porque muchas veces nuestros jóvenes les comienzan a vendérselas o a encontrarlas ahí, ¿no? Creo que el gobierno tiene también mucho que trabajar en ese sentido.
And as far as the government, Maggie's suggesting that the government could do a much better job on stopping or preventing young people from having access to guns. Because a lot of times young people get access to these weapons, and that's kind of a way into these organizations. So, stopping weapons trafficking, which is a major problem in Mexico, would be a good first step.
Pero de los que ya están desaparecidos, creo que al gobierno le toca hacer su trabajo, ¿no? De buscarlos y encontrarlos para poderles dar a mis compañeras la tranquilidad y la paz que ellos necesitan.
And as far as those people that are already disappeared, the government has to do its job to look for and find the people who are disappeared, to bring peace for the families who are searching for their loved ones.
¿Puedo añadir algo a esto? Bueno, la otra cosa que yo creo que... I'm sorry. Sorry. No, well, one of the things that I think that is very important is because in a lot of places, the recruiting of young people is being done with the help of local police. And with the help in the case of migrants, with the help of migratory agents. So I think that the first step that is very related to the state is to clean the institutions of this police, immigration, the army, because the borders between organized crime and the state are very blurred. So I think that's very important. The other thing, it has to do a promise that López Obrador did, the present government, and it was to give opportunity to young people so they would not have to get close to the organized crime, to have investment for the youth that are not having enough possibilities. So I think that there is a big challenge of how to give life opportunities to young people. And the other thing has to do with prevention at schools. That's something that they are doing also. They're going to schools, they're going to high schools, and they're trying to talk with young people about what kind of prevention measures. And we have been discussing a lot, in the case specifically of Regresando a Casa, what it means, the kind of masculinities that are being built, that are so linked to weapons, that are so linked to certain kind of power that is linked to violence. So the slogan that patriarchal violence is killing us all, not just women, not just femicide, it's also killing young men. So it's also something that should be dealt from education since high school. So they are going to high schools, to junior high school. When we see all this from the distance, imagine that your son had disappeared. You have all this pain, and with all this pain, you're trying to make laws, doing lobby, search appropriate forensics, go and search in the field, go to school, educate, change police. And they're going to all these places, trying to do all these different levels of, and many of them do not have even middle school. So they are our professors right now with the tools that they have that are appropriating all their kind of knowledge to go all over the place. So I think that sensibilización is a word that they use a lot in the schools to go on. So and just to give some context, and she can complete about what's going on for the people that are not familiar with this, is that there was a huge national debate because the numbers went out about the disappear when Carla started to make with this huge team. Some of them my students, by the way, that were there in her. So young people really wanted to do things differently, start to do a better census. So the numbers start to go up and up. And also because people, it's not that they disappear necessarily during this administration, but that the reports were better, so we have more numbers. And when this happened and elections were coming, so Lopez, the president, the government, actual government was like, oh, these numbers are too high. We need to, it's not helping, because even if they did disappear in my administration, these numbers are being used against me. So we need to have another numbers. And how can we have another number? So it was a lot of pressure, a huge debate going on there that implied, I mean, disqualifying the work that the commission had done by saying they have not checked correctly if people have appeared or not appeared already. And in order to correct these wrong numbers, they put people that were not qualified and that were working in social programs to do a new census, going house to house and to ask, is your kid back? But there were young people, the very precarious work that were working in some of, they were called the Serf of the Nation, Siervos de la Nación. So they were not psychologists or anything. And suddenly they told us that when they went house by house, knocking at the doors, they realized that people had gone back and they have not reported. So that made a huge, that was the context. I don't know what it is. Just to give some context.
Carla, you probably have a slightly more of an insider's view.
No, of course, like the reason I'm not longer commissioner, national commissioner, is because there was disagreement. Let's put it that way. A huge disagreement of how to deal with the registry. The law, again, I'm a lawyer, the law says that the National Commission is the one in charge of creating and coordinating this registry. This registry is fed, we can talk for hours about like technical issues of the technical system of the registry. But what is important to be said is that the commission is not the only institution that feeds the registry. There are at least 66 institutions, 33 fiscalías, 33 commissions that feed the registry. And there is a system that can tell you, I don't know how you translate it, trazabilidad.
Tracing.
That it's you can trace exactly what public servant put that information in there. And of course, when we talk about how many disappeared we have in Mexico, 115,000, 100,000, 114,000, it's a huge figure. And there might be some institutions that have not, that are not aware that some of the disappeared came back. But when I was explaining at the beginning what we did in the commission, we started crossing the databases, and we were able to find, but long before this conversation started, like 2 years ago, we started to cross the databases, and we found that some people were already back, and that's good. And we were able to like to change their status from disappeared to located. The problem is that and that's a problem. That political problem is that almost the same figure that was being located or found was being disappeared. So the number, the figure did not change that much. It changed the registry, it's public, and you can see it at any time, and you can see that the number that was going up, and up was the people that was being located. But the figure of the disappeared didn't move very much because yes, we can find 15,000 as they were saying. Yes, that's what we did. In 6 months, you can find 15,000 people. Yes. Were they victims of a crime? Not necessarily, and some of them they were. But the problem was that there were more and more people being disappeared, not only from this sexennia, from this administration. Remember that this is the first time that we have a registry. So institutions and also individuals, because any individual can report a disappearance too, have been coming to the registry and to the National Commission to report their disappeared. with our work, our forensic work that we started building the last year, and we started doing that in the last year because that was when we were able to have legal legal authorization to do so. When we were going to the small towns to take the DNA samples from families, we learned that 1 of every 3 families that came close to us had never ever reached any Mexican institution. So you can see that the problem that we have with if there's a problem with the registry, it's not a problem of how many more people we have registered, because let's say like we are finding them, but the problem is that there are more people being disappeared, and the huge problem is the people that are not being reported to the registry. Depending, they can tell you, depending on where in the country you go, they can tell you for each person that is registered, there is 1 more, or there is 2 more. I've heard 7 more. So the huge problem is who's not, it's not who's in the registry, it's who's not. That's why we were very cautious all the time when we talk about 150,000 person reported as disappeared. Not we cannot tell it that that's a universe, but it's the first time that Mexico has an official database that can start helping us understand what's going on. Now we know how many women, how many men, how old were they, where were they disappeared, and that should help the Mexican government to prevent the disappearances. That should, it doesn't, but it should. It should tell us like what's happening with young men. Are they being forcibly recruited? But in order for you to like to deal with forced recruitment, you have to accept there's forced recruitment, and who's recruiting them, and where are they, and how are they being recruited. So there is the beginning of a system that can give you information, and of course the registry has to be strengthened as any. But like the problem is not necessarily the system itself, but the institutions that fit the system, and I would add that the definition of disappear, because in this public crisis or public discussion is like, well, not all of them are forcibly disappeared. No one's saying no one's saying that. The law is very clear. The definition is very broad. How many of them are forcibly disappeared or victims of human trafficking or victims of forced displacement or recruitment, blah, blah, blah. We don't know because the Fiscalias don't give us that information, even though we ask them. We used to ask them. Sorry, still 8 months and it's still difficult. But we don't have the information, but we have the tools. So we have to protect the tools. We have to protect the registry, the system. We have to protect the methodology to identify bodies. We have to protect the context analysis, because Aida, as anthropologists, know how important it is for to find someone to understand what's going on.
I just wanted to, before we go back to the questions, I just wanted to ask another question to build on that. It seems like you were going up against the biggest powers in the country, as well as facing, organized crime, because as Aida mentioned, going out in the field obviously involves danger. So I just wanted to know, and I would also like to ask Maggie, the kind of risks you face, and if you faced direct threats, and if there's been any kind of investigation or response to those kinds of threats.
How should I respond? Direct threats, no. When I was a commissioner, as many of my fellow, of course, the mothers and fellow public servants, the commissions, we did receive different types of threats back then. And after leaving the commission, the Comisión Nacional de los Derechos Humanos, the National Commission of Human Rights, recommended the Comisión Nacional, the National Search Commission, to open an investigation against me. And as far as I know, that's the only one that I've heard of. But there's always a possibility in Mexico. You never know what can happen with the fiscalías, right? But not that I know.
And so the National Human Rights Commission has an investigation open against you, is what you're saying?
And it ordered the National Commission of the Search of the where I used to work to open an investigation and an administrative investigations against me because of the registry.
And Maggie, hablaste un poco de las amenazas que enfrentas en México y quería ver si puedes hablar un poco más de los riesgos que corren, bueno, tanto tú como tus compañeras por ese trabajo. Just wanted to ask Maggie about the risks that she's and her colleagues have faced because of their work.
Creo que el simple hecho de levantar la voz nos pone en riesgo.
Just raising your voice puts us at risk.
Desafortunadamente, en México, el ser una madre buscadora, nos están matando por eso.
Unfortunately, in Mexico, just being a searching mother, they're killing us because we're searching for our kids.
Sí, desafortunadamente, el mismo gobierno nos dice, levanten una denuncia contra lo que están viviendo.
The government tells us to file a complaint because of what we're going through.
Pero al hacerlo, las mismas autoridades nos dejan solas.
But when we file that complaint, the authorities just abandon us.
Así que el riesgo, pues bien no vale, ¿no? Porque al final de cuentas son nuestros hijos y creo que todo padre no le importaría arriesgar su vida por encontrar a su hijo.
But despite that, the risk is worth it because I think any parent would do whatever it takes, no matter the risks, to find.
En mi caso, por haber levantado la voz, intentaron llevarse a mi hija, la más grande.
In my case, because of raising my voice and denouncing what happened, they tried to take away my oldest daughter.
Al niño de mi hija.
And the son of my daughter, my grandson.
En mi caso, el mismo presidente de mi municipio también hizo cosas en contra de nosotros.
And the actual mayor of my municipality did ¿qué tipo de cosas?
Decir que lo que yo decía no era cierto.
Said that what I was saying, what I was denouncing wasn't true.
Y así todas mis compañeras están en lo mismo, están en riesgo todas por el simple hecho de buscar a nuestros.
And all of my colleagues are facing similar risks for the simple act of looking for our children.
Y en el estado, in this same state, 2 years ago, one of the mothers, Maria Luisa Garduño, was killed. She was in the same where they work. It was the leader of another collective. She was killed.
They're looking for her daughter.
I think there was another question. Oh,
I don't.
Jenny, you have a question?
Yes, so when you were talking about education, I thought that was so important because if we want to change the future, we have to change the future generation. If they all think if they all think this is important, then there is a change. There's a possibility to effect a change. So I know the mothers are going to the schools, but is there anything that can be done at the slightly larger scale in terms of educating the children so that from a younger, because I feel a lot of things by high school, it's already too late. The kids during that time, some of their thoughts have already been formed. So it really needs to be younger, maybe in late elementary school, middle school time period, where they get educated, and children are often the ones that can change the views of parents, because adults are usually very stubborn and they will only change for probably their children. So is there something that can be done maybe at the larger scale in terms of education so that this can stop happening?
Está preguntando si, hablando de la importancia de la educación, como mencionaste, si hay algo más que se pueda hacer a nivel, quizá a una escala más grande, para educar a los niños, porque pues es la siguiente generación, es el futuro, y en particular pensando si se podría educar a los niños más jóvenes, porque quizá para para cuando ya están en secundaria o prepa ya están formados. Y quizá habría alguna forma de educar niños que estén en primaria sobre este asunto, sobre lo que está viviendo el país, para tratar de frenar lo que está ocurriendo.
Sí, es lo mismo que estamos haciendo como colectivo, sensibilizar en las escuelas, iniciando prácticamente desde el kinder, porque son chiquitos, pero nos ha funcionado. El colectivo lo ha hecho, sí, y nos ha funcionado eso.
Okay, so you're saying that so they're actually, as well as high school, they're also doing kindergarten and preschool. And because even though they're young, they actually do understand quite a lot. And so that's been something that the collective has been working on, is to go to not just high schools, but also elementary schools. I think, yes, you had a question.
Lo voy a hacer en español primero y luego lo voy a traducir. Yo tengo una pregunta muy literal. Yo estudio literatura, tengo familia en el norte del país, en lugares donde hay muchos desaparecidos. Y yo estoy trabajando en un papel que voy a publicar teorizando desde testimonios escritos, ¿no? Y ustedes tres han confirmado que es engaging, o sea, estar buscando una persona es literalmente ponerte en peligro, perder conexiones con tu familia, y yo tengo el privilegio de estar aquí, pero mi familia no, y es mi familia directa. Entonces, mi pregunta es, más allá de un apoyo financiero, más allá de yo leer testimonios y crear mis propias teorías de lectura literal, ¿cómo se ve esta teorización sin que, cómo puedo teorizar yo con los colectivos sin poner en peligro a mi mamá y mi papá y al a los hijos de mi papá, por ejemplo? O sea, ¿cómo se ve eso? Porque una cosa soy yo, otra cosa son otras personas.
¿Lo vas a traducir?
Oh, sí. Yeah, I wanted to know, long story short, how does theorizing with search collectives looks like when you have family in Mexico in dangerous places that could be suffering consequences because you in the United States are capable of doing your research?
Bueno, primero yo diría que, I'm sorry, English, I'm so confused with languages, because it has to do with theorizing from distance. I think that there are two levels. I think that on one level, there is always certain risk. There's always, even if I mean, being quiet is something that will anything you say always created a certain level of risk. But so it depends of what you want to do. But even at the distance, what you are, there are many things that you can do, engage in them. For example, people always ask them, what we can do. And one of the things that people can do is to help them to make an echo of their struggles, to reproduce what they are doing, to visibilizar. In the case of Regresando a Casa, for example, they wrote their own book. The book is called Sanadoras de Memorias, Healers of Memories. And it was written in a workshop that was taught by ex-inmates, people that are out of the prison. So it's like the right of self-representation. And it's a beautiful book that just was published last year. And to make an echo of their own writing, not just to write about their writing, but to make an echo of their writings. It's something that from literary critics can be done. I know that also the group in Estado de Mexico, it wrote their own book also in a collective process. So make more echo of what they are writing is something you can do. And of course, I'm sometimes concerned about my son, but I don't know how to say, but the kind of work that we do, I mean, there's a level of risk, but isn't that because I'm teaching about disappearance, they will come and get me from my office. There is also many thinking about intersectionality, a lot of class intersectionality on vulnerabilities. So, of course, if I go to Sinaloa and I go to the Sierra and I try to interview people in the middle of the Sierra and I go by myself and I drive. So there are many other measures that you have to take for self-care. But being a scholar in Mexico that writes about the main risk that I know I have is with them when we go to searches in the field. But being a literary critic, it would be very weird that somebody will affect your family because you are writing about testimonies in Mexico.
Sí, Sí, pero estoy de acuerdo con usted, que no puedes, o sea, hay un problema porque entiendo que se tiene que ir al mero lugar para entender lo que es la experiencia, pero al mismo tiempo, o sea, es alguien más, o sea, son otras personas, no soy yo. No sé, disculpe, es un problema filosófico que yo tengo.
Well, but thinking about text, so one thing very concise is to go to their own text. They are writing to go to their own text and take very seriously what they are writing. I think that's.
If I can add, like, I cannot talk as an academic. I've been now for 6 months only, but when you are on the field, the risk is always there. And the risk of not only, of course, of the families of the disappeared, but I have to repeat because almost no one talks about all the public servants that are there. And they put their families in risk. That's true. And many of the buscadoras oficiales, de las comisiones and the fiscalías, they don't talk about their families. Many of the buscadores from the CNB, when you go to look in Veracruz, in certain towns, and if you're from there, they don't even say hi. I'm from Sinaloa. When I went to search to Sinaloa, I didn't even tell my family I was going there. Your public life is you like delete everything about your family. Of course, there's a risk. There's a risk.
I didn't try to minimize, but because she said she's doing literary
No,
critique.
I know, and I don't have an answer to that.
Tenemos una pregunta de Zoom.
¿Puedo hacer una pregunta?
Sí, claro.
Primero, muchísimas gracias por traer toda esta información y experiencias al campus, que es algo que, como dijiste tú, Aida, nuestros maestros vienen un poco más en la teoría, entonces nunca estamos expuestos. I have a question, and maybe two parts. What does the campaign leadership look like of this campaign that you're bringing here? And how could we join? Like, I would love to, bring it here to school with Mexican students, but also with like American students, because we could like maybe do something to help the campaign.
¿Quieres traducir para Nani?
Sí, perdón. Pregunto que cómo se ve el liderazgo de la campaña de la que son parte, porque me encantaría unirme como que a la campaña y traerla aquí con los estudiantes, no solo mexicanos, también americanos, que pues como nos contaron, Estados Unidos tiene un gran rol en estas desapariciones.
Entonces, bueno, pues primero ha sido muy lindo, platicamos, porque es un llamado a la unidad. Entonces hay un liderazgo bastante extendido, es decir, la conferencia de prensa se dio en muchos estados y como todas las relaciones humanas, en muchos estados los colectivos están divididos y o surgieron de uno y se hizo otro y se hizo otro. Y ahora se juntaron en muchos lados y lo hicieron la conferencia de prensa unida. Entonces, creo que por supuesto hay figuras morales. En México, María Herrera, que ella tiene 4 hijos desaparecidos, se le conoce como la madre. Ella y su hijo Juan Carlos Trujillo son figuras icónicas, pero no es un liderazgo centralizado. Aunque ellos están ahí, ellos respetan mucho la autonomía de los colectivos y ellas hicieron un llamado y los colectivos tienen. Entonces, el liderazgo está por muchos lados. Y el llamado, pues, hay que, lo que yo digo, hacer eco, por ejemplo, solo así de lejos. Ellos están sacando comunicados, pues ustedes manejan redes sociales. Hay que tomar esos comunicados y reproducirlos, darlos a conocer. Están utilizando muchísimo los medios. Ahorita con la campaña hubo videos, mucho, sí. ¿Verdad? Bueno, Maggie es mucho más activista digital que yo. Yo soy predigital, ella hace TikToks. Ahí está hace muchos TikToks con mensajes, entonces, pues hay que hacer eco. Tal vez la primera cosa que yo te diría es busca sus redes sociales y a partir de las redes, el de ellas es Regresando a Casa Morelos y el tuyo es específico.
Ay, bueno, ahí está.
Ahorita lo ponemos aquí está en el deck, te lo pasamos, aquí vienen. Y a partir de eso, pues una cosa es empezar a rebotarles, ¿no? A reproducir lo que ellas están. Ellas hicieron un documental con apoyo de una compañera de mi colectiva, que es la Hermanas en la Sombra, y ella se llama Carolina Corral. El documental se llama Volverte a Ver, está subtitulado en español. Se puede hacer, por ejemplo, en el marco de la campaña, presentar el documental e invitar a hacer un cine debate con los estudiantes mexicanos aquí. Si te interesa, podemos conseguirte volverte a ver y que lo vean y se arme un cine debate. Es una cosa que se puede hacer muy concreta para hacer.
Bueno, pues creo que hemos llegado al fin de nuestro panel. I think we've come to the end of our panel. I want to thank our wonderful panelists, Maggie, Aida, Carla. This has been so enlightening for me and I'm sure for everyone else. And thank you to the Rockefeller Center. This has been a really wonderful event. So thank you very much.
Compañeras que nos están siguiendo en redes sociales, a las compañeras en especial de Regresando a Casa Morelos y a las compañeras, todas las de los colectivos que están ahora en la Unidad Nacional, pues nada más que la campaña está de este lado también y un saludo solidario.
Saludos también allá. Y I'm gonna update the presentation. I sent the wrong one, but it has a couple of typos on. I sent to Joel the. Okay.
And we can give you a copy of this, guardar de las redes sociales de ellos para que puedan hacer el contacto.
Ahorita más.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Julián.
No, gracias. Sí.
Lo último me puse más nervioso porque lo estoy viviendo ahorita y no.
Puedo dar tu gracias.
Gracias por organizarlo.
Pues Morela, que estamos aquí, teníamos que pasar.
No tengo la experiencia.
Muchas gracias, Julián. Sé que te enfadamos mucho.
La experiencia con la generación.